Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I hope you are having a wonderful week so far, coming off of a great weekend. I just spent a little over a week on jury duty. It was my first time ever sitting on a jury. It was a criminal trial. We reached a verdict. I'm not going to go into detail about the case, but it was equal parts interesting and insanely boring. That's all I can say about that. Sometimes, yeah, it was interesting, and at other points it was like, oof. I mean, I knew it wasn't going to be like it was on TV, but wow, I wasn't expecting my coffee is not strong enough for this boredom portion of the trial. At any rate, it is Tuesday and we have an author interview as usual. This author is, a former coworker of mine. Her name is Juliet Cutler, and it's kind of strange. It's kind of strange how many people I know who have written books and who have then come on the podcast. I think that's amazing that I have so many writer and author friends in my relatively small circle of acquaintances. It's also interesting for me to have spoken with Juliet about her book because we worked together over 20 years ago at a Lutheran summer camp in Montana. I may have spoken about it before. I don't even know. So we knew each other for 10 weeks one summer in 1997, I think. Maybe 98. I think I worked there 97 and 98. So 97 probably. And I have not seen her since. Our lives took us in different directions. In fact, before we started recording, we spent some time catching up, incredibly briefly on the last 23 years since we, not quite 23 years, but over 20 years since we last saw each other. And so it's strange to have a conversation with someone that you knew in a very specific setting for a very brief time, and then over 20 years later, have a conversation. So, you kind of know them, but not really. At any rate, it was a lot of fun to catch up with Juliet and to talk about this book, which I found fascinating. And you might be thinking to yourself, would you just tell me the name of the book, please? And yes, I shall. The book is called Among the Maasai. It is a memoir. As I said, it is by Juliet Cutler. In 1999, Juliet Cutler leaves the United States to teach at the first school for Maasai girls in East Africa, marking the beginning of a 20-year journey to empower young Maasai women through education. Working alongside local teachers, Cutler is transformed by the community she finds in Tanzania and by witnessing the life-changing impacts of education on her students, many of whom face staggering poverty, forced marriages, genital cutting, and other forms of gender-based violence. That is the description of this memoir. It covers those 2 years of teaching, but also a lot of what has gone on in the 20 years since she started teaching there, and her continued relationship with the school and her evolving role in that relationship. I found this book to be so fascinating. Because it's, again, someone I knew very briefly, and now I'm getting this glimpse into her life and a life that I didn't know much about, but also because I didn't know a lot about the Maasai. I know a little bit from readings here and there, but this gives a really good perspective on how their culture is changing because they are a nomadic society. So how that is evolving as the world around them changes, how is changing in terms of education, especially educating girls. And Juliet's perspective on that, especially coming in as an outsider and a white outsider, she's so thoughtful and so conscientious of that role, her role as a white American coming in, being perceived in a certain way, her history, maybe not personally, but obviously the cultural history of colonialism and how that affects a white person's relationship with a colonized people. She just does a really masterful job of delving into all of these topics and bringing it together in a memoir that is so engaging and so easy to read and experience. I say it reads almost like a novel. It's not quite a novel, but because she intertwines not only her story, but the story of some of her students, you get different aspects and different perspectives. And so you get a bit of those novel-like qualities. And I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot from this book. So let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Juliet Cutler. Again, the book is Among the Maasai, a memoir. Hi, Juliet. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
It is wonderful to have you here, and I am excited to talk about your memoir. It's called Among the Maasai. Before we get to the memoir, though, if you could share just a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit, that would be great.
Sure. My name is Juliet Cutler, and I currently live just outside of Atlanta in a small community called Serenbe that's focused on art, the environment, and culture. So it's sort of an interesting place in that it's built around an organic farm as well. I've lived in a number of different places. I moved to Atlanta from Amsterdam, where my husband and I lived for about 6 years. We've also lived in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I grew up in Montana. So part of that biography is in the narrative of my memoir, but that's a little bit about who I am. Professionally, I work as a planner and writer for clients around the world, developing educational programs and exhibits for places like national and state parks, museums, nature centers, places like that.
Wow, that sounds like a really fascinating, just from the overview, sounds very interesting. We could probably have a whole long conversation just about your life. But since it's a book podcast, we'll jump to the book. It is a memoir, as I said, and it's called Among the Maasai. So can you give a bit of an overview of the story?
Right. So the story is largely set right at the turn of the 21st century. So I went over just after I had finished my undergrad degree, and I was partway through my graduate degree. I came out of my undergrad as a certified English teacher, and I heard the stories of these young Maasai women who so desperately wanted to go to school that they would run away from home, show up on the doorstep of this secondary school and beg for a place there. The Maasai have historically herded cattle and goats in the Great Rift Valley, and I think as the 21st century approached, they faced a lot of changes to their historical land and water rights, as well as the encroachment of globalization. And I think these young women really saw education as a pathway to a better future. And so I was really moved by those stories of these young women and their plight, and volunteered to teach in East Africa for 2 years. I was there as a volunteer English teacher. And so this memoir really tells the story of what it was like as a young American to go abroad, to work there for 2 years in a culture that was radically different from my own. It talks a lot about my transformation, the things that I learned from that process, It also shares the stories of some of my students and the issues that they faced as young Maasai women. So it's sort of a coming of age story in many ways. The story continues through, though, really almost to the present, in that it talks about what it was like to come back to the United States, and then sort of paints a picture of what this school has achieved over the last 20 years in the transformation of young women's lives who live on the margins where poverty and violence is very prevalent.
We're going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be speaking about a young woman in the book who has certain parallels to Juliet's story. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Juliet Cutler about her memoir, Among the Maasai, and let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
Yeah, and there is a young woman in the book. It feels like you kind of tell her story in parallel with yours, and please pronounce her name for me because I don't want to butcher it. Starts with N.
Yep. It's Nangita, and I do, the book starts really with her story of what it means to grow up being Maasai and the challenges that she faces as a young woman trying to find her way in the world. And that leads her to more or less run away from home to this school. And it traces her story, sort of what she faces related to things like arranged marriages, and the Maasai still practice female genital cutting as part of a coming of age ceremony, and then traces her all the way through a college education. And while my story obviously is radically different from hers, in that I come from a very different place and a very different culture, I also left home to explore a big, broad world and learn from that process. And so there are some parallels in the ways in which Nangita and I come to understand that the world is a lot bigger than we thought it was at the beginning of the book.
And one thing that I really appreciated about the book, especially your time teaching there, was obviously you went over with, your experience, your life experience, and encountered a vastly different culture. Some of your students, though, were also encountering a different culture than what they'd grown up with. But as I said, I appreciated about the book was your struggle, your journey, however you want to describe it, with figuring out what your role was there, how you could help without bringing, so much cultural baggage in terms of being a white person in an African community, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about that process for you and what you learned from the experience?
Absolutely. So, as I said earlier, I grew up in Montana, and the Crow Indian Reservation is not that far from where I grew up. So I grew up understanding the long history of white intervention in indigenous populations and how that's led to a lot of challenges for American Indian communities here in the United States. And so that was the lens that I brought with me when I went to Tanzania. certainly I wanted to help. I went there because I thought I could help, but I didn't want to inculcate my own ideas or cultures on a different culture. And so I was very careful in terms of doing my homework about this school. It was established by a group of Maasai elders who really saw the ways in which their culture was being stressed and threatened as globalization approached. When I was there, we didn't have any telephone service, but now if you go to Tanzania, you'll see the Maasai still herding their cattle and goats while talking on cell phones. And so, sort of this global culture was approaching. And so these Maasai elders saw education as a pathway forward to develop new leaders that would face new challenges in the 21st century. And in their wisdom, they saw that girls had traditionally not had many opportunities at all for education. And so they really needed to create a special place for girls where girls could thrive and gain an education in order to sort of develop a balance to leadership for the future. And so those are really the roots of the school in terms of the idea and the inception for it. Of course, those Maasai elders partnered with a nonprofit organization here in the United States called Operation Bootstrap Africa that provides most of the funding for this school. So the roots of the school really are coming from sort of the Maasai request for assistance in doing this work. Certainly, one of the things I learned as part of being there is that we always come with our culture. That's sort of impossible to leave behind. And so, I did my best to sort of follow the lead of local people and rather than sort of coming in and saying, I have the answers and I'm here to save you, sort of saying, I'm here to help. Please guide and direct me in the ways I can be most helpful to you.
Yeah, and you went with your then boyfriend, then fiance, and now you're married. You went with another person. Did you? He worked at another school close by, but did you have a lot of? What am I trying to say? I would imagine that your conversations on all of these topics were a huge part of your lives and your relationship at that time. Did you find that it helped to have someone that very close to you to have those conversations with, to clarify, or did it help give you any different perspective? How was that in terms of that? That's a pretty incredible relationship step. So how was that for the two of you?
I think this experience in Tanzania really defined who we are individually and who we are as a couple. It shaped the way we view the world and our role in it. And so all of those things are sort of foundational ultimately to a marriage, that you sort of have a similar outlook. But I think it wasn't just Mark, who's my now husband, who I shared this journey with. I think whenever you have a big experience in life that challenges you and shapes you, it's important to have friends and mentors along the way. And certainly Mark was and is that to me. But there were also some key people I talk about in the book who were a bit older than us and served as mentors. One of those was a Tanzanian educator named Dr. Msajili. He served as a local mentor to both of us, guiding us as we navigated our way in a different culture. And then we had some Americans who were there who also served as mentors to us and resources just in dealing with some of the things that you deal with when you're in a different culture, and also when you live in a place of deep poverty. And so I talk in the book a little bit about Jean and Marv. They were a couple that were placed at the same school that I taught at. And then there was another couple, Doug and Linda, also Americans, who served as volunteer coordinators in Tanzania. And they also served as a resource to us. So I think, for people who might be considering undertaking a volunteer excursion in another place, finding a support system is important, whether it be amongst local people, amongst the people you go with, or even amongst sort of resources that may be foreign but familiar on the ground there.
Mm-hmm. And how was it to be in a relationship and get married from your own cultural perspective while living in a place that has very different understandings of marriage and gender roles?
So that was a little nervous for us at first. We went into the experience sort of having been coached that courtship looks a lot different in Tanzania than it does here in America. Among the Maasai, there isn't really courtship. Marriages are arranged. And so how do you behave as a young couple in a context where the rules are different about how you relate to one another? That said, I think we were granted a lot of leeway because people understood that we were different and we came from a different place. And so once we got there, it wasn't as awkward as we thought it might be. And the local schools that we taught at there, as you said earlier, I was at the Maasai Girls Secondary School, and Mark was at Maasai Secondary School. So both are boarding schools, as are most secondary schools in Tanzania, because there aren't the resources for a robust system of public high schools anyway. And these schools were only about a mile apart, and the staffs came together to throw us a wedding shower when we came back from getting married. And so it was really delightful to be welcomed in that way as a couple, and to be part of their cultural sort of celebrations related to marriage. But then we also had a wedding here in the States, and I talk in the book a little bit about how that was a sort of odd experience to have been living in Tanzania and come back home and sort of walk back into your own culture, which now seems somehow a bit foreign, as if you don't altogether fit. And also to come from a place of deep poverty to a place of wealth. And how do you navigate when your friends and colleagues back in Tanzania sometimes struggle to send their children to school, for the Maasai, many of them struggle to feed their children. You come from that kind of a context to a context of, in some ways, excess, and how do you navigate that? How do you come to terms with that? And so I talk a lot in the book about that in relationship to our wedding, but also in relationship to coming back to the United States to live on a more permanent basis.
Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, Juliet will be talking about some of the big picture things that she learned from her experience, some of the non-big picture things she learned from her experiences in Tanzania. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the continuation of my interview with Juliet Cutler.
What would you say the biggest learning experience was for you in those 2 years?
Well, I think there are a couple of big takeaways for me. Um, One I alluded to earlier, that as an outside, I sometimes say change doesn't come from the outside in, it comes from the inside out. And so as a foreigner coming into a place with good intentions, I think I learned that it's always our role to follow rather than lead. And that, I think that's not always easy for Westerners because we're used to coming in with our plans and our timelines and our budgets and getting everyone in order and sort of moving toward a goal. But that's not always how things operate in other places. And so really to come in and take a step back and to listen rather than lead. And so that was sort of a big piece of learning for me. And also just a recognition that there are many Tanzanian and Maasai people who intimately know the issues that they face and how to solve them and are leaders in their communities already. And so really we have to empower those folks to solve the problems that they already know how to solve, but sometimes lack the resources to solve. And so we're really there as helpers and supporters of those local people. So that was sort of one big takeaway. And then I think the other takeaway for me was I think it was the first time in my life that I had really been confronted with my own privilege and just the opportunities that I had simply because I was American, I was white, I was, relatively affluent compared to the rest of the world. And it never had really occurred to me that all of that was just kind of a given. And for a lot of people around the world, like 80% of the rest of the world, that they just don't have access to the same things that I have access to just because of where I was born. And so that was something that sort of squarely hit me between the eyes many times while I was living in Tanzania.
Yeah, and I can only imagine that it was just an incredible 2 years full of a lot of learning and amazing experiences, but also difficult experiences. I know you have had a relationship with the school there since you left teaching. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship and how it has evolved?
Sure. So I think one of the realizations that sort of came from those two pieces of learning that I just talked about was that those of us who have some privilege and have some power have a responsibility to wield that privilege and power responsibly and to empower and give back to those who are looking for those kinds of opportunities. And so I think coming back, I really felt that it was important to maintain this relationship with the school and to continue to support the work of local leaders there. And so I go back almost on an annual basis now. Largely my role now is as a fundraiser here in the United States. There are a couple of organizations that continue to support the work in Tanzania. I spoke about one earlier, Operation Bootstrap Africa. They've provided all the funding to construct the school, but also scholarships for all the students who attend that school. And they've been doing that for 25 years now. So a long and deep connection there. And then one of the other pieces of learning that came out of my time in Tanzania is that sometimes it's not enough just to give a girl a scholarship and get her to school, because if she doesn't feel safe at home or in her community, then she may not finish school. And I talk in the book about a couple of young women who face issues of violence at home and the effect of that ultimately on their lives and their education. And so Dr. Msinjili, who was a mentor of ours there, he started a safe house shortly after we left. And the safe house is a place for young women who aren't safe at home to be during school breaks, so that they don't sort of face the risk of not being able to come back to school for whatever reason, whether it be that they're forced into a marriage or in Tanzania, this law has just changed within the last 6 months, but it used to be that it was illegal to readmit a young woman to secondary school once she'd had a baby. And so that law has fortunately just changed. But so for a young woman who might go home during a school break, get raped, she's pregnant, that sort of immediately then ends her education. And that's still a pretty prevalent practice in Tanzania, but fortunately it's no longer the law. And so, he would create the safe house. He created the safe house where young women could go and have a safe place to be so that they could finish their educations. And that work has been funded largely through Lutheran Partners in Global Ministry, but also is partnered with a local, they call them NGOs in the international community, but non-governmental organization, which is what we call nonprofits, called Mwangaza. And Mwangaza is led entirely by Tanzanians, and they're focused on how to make schools safe places for kids, but also on empowering women and girls through community-based education programs. So those are the ways that I remain connected there, is in supporting those organizations and the work that they're doing by raising money here among Americans, by writing this book. All proceeds from the sale of the book are going back to support these two organizations that I just spoke about. So the impetus for the book really came about, I think, on the one hand, it was an effort for me to sort of process what this whole experience had meant to me, but it was also meant to be a tool to raise awareness about the issues that young women and girls face, not only in East Africa, but around the world, and the ways in which we might support and uplift these young women.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. What would you hope that readers would take away from the book?
I think the biggest takeaway I would have for readers is the profound effect that education has on women and girls who live in poverty. It really does have the power to transform lives. Research in the field of international development sort of bears out that the single most effective intervention for poverty alleviation is the education, particularly for women and girls in the developing world. And so I think the book really paints that picture of how young Maasai women have benefited from education. One of the really great things about 20 years of retrospect is that I know what's happened to many of my students. The graduates of the Maasai Secondary School for Girls are now in all sectors of Tanzania. They are leaders within their own communities, but they've also started nonprofit organizations that are addressing some of the most pressing issues for the Maasai, which are land and water rights, access to education and healthcare. They are teachers, pastors, attorneys. We have one graduate who's spoken at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues a few times now. And so these young women have come from very, very humble beginnings to really be leaders, not just among the Maasai, but internationally in some cases. And so that's really the ways education makes a difference. And I think, readers may not have a particular affinity for supporting Maasai girls' education, but what I would say is there are ways to support the education of women and girls where you live, and this is a need all over the world. And so I hope readers will be inspired by the stories of these young women and the ways that education can transform lives.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's obviously something that is very near and dear to your heart, and you are passionate about it, so I appreciate that.
And it's time for our final break of the podcast. When we come back, before we get to the conclusion of this interview, we will get my normal random question, awkward interview question. You know how it is. So you won't want to miss that. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Juliet Cutler.
Slightly random question. Are you fluent in Swahili?
I think fluent would be taking it too far, but it's been 20 years since I lived there, and so of course I go back and I have an opportunity to practice when I'm there, but my Swahili is very rusty, and so I think I was somewhat functional when I lived there, but to say that I was fluent would be probably an overstatement of my language skill.
I ask because I do a lot. I tend to project a lot while I'm reading a book and think of myself in a situation, and I'm just amazed when people go to a culture where they do not speak the language, fluently or conversationally is one thing, but I just don't know that I'm that brave to go and try to speak to people in a language that is not my own. So I am impressed with people who can do that.
Well, one of the first things we did when we arrived in country was spend, I think it was about 6 weeks at a language school, and that gave me a working knowledge, but learning foreign languages has always been a struggle for me. So I think I cobbled it together and made it work, but I think it wasn't without, I think you have to have a good sense of humor because sometimes the things that come out of your mouth are not what you intend, or there's just funny situations that arise, but we had to learn to laugh at ourselves quite a bit there.
I bet. Would you like to write another book, whether a memoir or something else?
I think the short answer to that is yes. I don't have a specific project on the horizon right now. I did just finish a book for the National Park Foundation. It's a junior ranger book about the Transcontinental Railroad. So professionally, I do a lot of writing, and I think it would be fantastic to write a book for one of the sites that I work at. I often get to work at historically significant sites or places that have beautiful natural resources. And so I think that would be possible for me. In terms of a book that's this close to my heart and sort of this personal, I don't know that I have another book like that in me, but maybe another book.
Okay. Thank you. And I know you do a lot of writing, as you said, for your work, and you've written throughout your professional life. How was writing this memoir different, or even inspired by some of the other writing that you've done in your life?
Well, I think anybody who reads the book will find that it's a deeply personal book. I don't pull punches, and I reveal a lot about what this experience meant to me, and in some cases the toll it took on me. And so in that way, writing this book was a very emotional process for me. And I said earlier that I wrote it to process what the experience meant. And so it took me almost a decade to write this book. And it really did start as an effort to make sense of the experience, and then sort of evolved into a book project. And the manuscript was finished for a couple of years. I sat on it because I wasn't really sure I wanted to make myself vulnerable in the way that I do in the book and put this into the world. And some friends read it and sort of said, you really need to publish this. And so then it took me a while to find a publisher and go through that process. So I would say, this book is something that's personally important to me, and was an emotional experience to write and sort of a processing kind of experience. Whereas the professional writing that I do is, I think there are still emotional components to the professional writing I do, because frequently the work that I do is about protecting these really important natural resources or talking about history that's shaped who we are as a nation or as a culture. And so really the way to draw readers in, no matter whether you're writing a book or whether you're writing exhibit content, is to appeal to those sort of universal ideas and emotions that we share. And so I think that that's sort of the commonality in the writing that I do. But I think in my professional life, it sort of feels a lot more like an academic process than the writing of this book was.
Sure. So out of your particular experience with writing and writing this book, would you have advice for aspiring authors?
I think for me, writing is as much art as it is discipline. And so I really have to sort of identify writing as my job. And it's the thing, even on days when I don't feel like it, that I sit down and I do. And it's a job. And so I think for aspiring authors, sometimes I do what's called time boxing, where like I don't want to write today, but I know I need to write today. And so time boxing is saying, I'm going to write for 30 minutes and then I'm going to stand up for 10. And then I'm going to write for 30 minutes and I'm going to stand up for 10. Where you sort of give yourself a set amount of time that you're going to write, even if it sucks in every way. And so sometimes I just have to do that in order to force it. And so I say for aspiring authors, sometimes it's about creating some discipline around your writing practice. That's been important to me. But also I think in terms of aspiring authors who aspire to publish, I think the publishing landscape is shifting radically and has been for a while. And so I think it's important to find your niche in terms of where you fit. And for me, it was a small independent press that publishes only women writers. But for other writers, there might be a different niche. But I think educating yourself as much as you can about the way the publishing industry is changing and finding your path there is not without its challenges, but important as the writing work.
So when you take the time to read for yourself, do you have favorite authors or genres that you turn to?
That's a good question. Choosing a favorite author or a favorite genre is kind of like asking me to choose a favorite food. It depends on the day and what I feel like. But I will say that I am a big fan of Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodan. They wrote a book a number of years ago that sort of inspired me to write the book that I've written, which is Half the Sky. And that title is based on I believe it's a Chinese proverb that women hold up half the sky. And they tell the story of a number of different women across the globe and the challenges that those women face. And they're out with a new book right now that's at the top of my list. I haven't read it yet, but it's called Tightrope. And it's actually focused here domestically around the plight of the middle class. And so I'm excited about that book. I've also recently finished Melinda Gates' book, Moment of Lift. And again, she's talking in that book about women's issues around the world. And so certainly I like to read other authors who are writing about issues that are important to me, sort of more on the fiction side. I've finished a book recently by Ya Gyasi called Homegoing, and that's a book of fiction that's set both in West Africa but also here in the United States. And I think the theme that runs through that is the way that violence resonates through generations. And so it's really the story of slavery and its impact here in America, but also in West Africa, specifically on a specific family. And then I think sort of my all-time favorite books are the Harry Potter series, a great escape into a world where good reigns over evil.
Yeah. Sometimes you just need that on any given day. Where can people find you on social media and the internet? Do you have a website? Where can people interact with you?
I do have a website. It's just my name, so julietcutler.com. And there are a number of resources on there for people who are interested in the issues that I've talked about today, namely empowering women through education. There's also a book group guide with some questions for people who might want to read this as part of a book club. And then there's also links there to the organizations that I spoke about today, Operation Bootstrap Africa and Mwangaza, if you're interested in supporting this work further. As I said earlier, just by buying the book, you're supporting the work because the proceeds are going back to these causes. But that's where I am on the internet, and then I'm on all social media platforms, so you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Okay, thank you for that. We have talked about a variety of different topics, but is there anything that we have not covered that you wanted to mention in terms of the memoir, in terms of the Maasai, in terms of writing? Anything that we haven't talked about?
No, I think we've really covered the ground. I appreciate the opportunity to join you on your podcast.
Well, thank you so much for being here with me. I greatly appreciate it. And the book is great. It reads a bit like a novel, and so it's a good read and very educational.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you once again to Juliet for joining me to talk about her memoir. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I appreciate you so much. And if you are a fan of this podcast, this is my usual spiel, plea, what have you, for you to subscribe to this podcast so you can be the first to get new episodes. Follow us on social media, like, retweet, do all of those wonderful things that help us out. And the thing that helps us out the very most to get this podcast out to more book lovers like you is a nice 5-star review on iTunes or I guess it's Apple Podcasts now, isn't it? But those 5-star reviews are extremely helpful. So if you are so inclined, I would be very appreciative. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I hope you're having a wonderful, wonderful week, and I hope, as always, that week involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.